I never expected her to open the door, let alone remember my name. It was just another Tuesday, gray and slow, the kind of morning where the coffee shop smells like wet coats and quiet conversations. I was half buried in my laptop, fingers hovering over a draft I didn't intend to finish, when the bell above the door jingled. She stepped in. I noticed first the way her coat hung just slightly off one shoulder, as if she'd shrugged it on in a hurry. Then her hair caught the light, a muted brown with streaks of silver, and for a second it made everything else fade. The espresso machine's hiss, the low hum of indie music, the man coughing over by the window. "Hey," she said, and there it was, that faint curve at the edge of her mouth that made me pause, even though I hadn't expected to see her. "Hi," I managed. My voice sounded too loud in my own ears. She glanced at the counter, then back at me, and I realized she'd remembered. "Double espresso." "Right." I nodded, surprised, and tried to tuck my hands under the table like it mattered. I had no idea why her remembering my order made my chest feel tight. We settled into a quiet rhythm. She read from a notebook, scribbling lines with a pen that clicked softly. I tried not to watch her, but my eyes kept drifting. How her fingers lingered on the page, the slight tilt of her head when she considered a sentence, the way her eyes flicked toward the window and caught the morning light just right. Tiny things, ordinary, but enough to make my coffee taste like something else entirely. I didn't speak much. Usually, I filled my days with drafts, half-finished emails, and unsent messages. My loneliness had no dramatic shape. It lived in paused thoughts and the small ritual of folding napkins into neat triangles, one by one, imagining someone noticing the care behind it. At some point, she looked up, and our eyes caught. Not a long gaze, just enough to acknowledge something, a tiny collision of awareness. I realized my thumb had been tapping against the edge of my notebook. She smiled, almost imperceptibly, and for a second the room felt quieter, not because of sound, but because of what wasn't being said. "Your friend's party on Saturday," she said, almost like an afterthought. "Are you going?" Maybe." My words stumbled, but I didn't want to sound too eager. My hands twisted the strap of my bag. "Good. It's nothing fancy." She shrugged, eyes moving to the window again. Then, almost casually, "You should come by sometime. I've got some prints I think you'd like." I blinked. "Prints? Photography?" She tapped her notebook. "You'll see." Her coat rustled as she gathered her things. I noticed again the slight tension in her shoulders, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how the light caught the silver streak. I didn't know why I wanted to linger, but I did. "See you," I said, when she finally turned the knob. "See you," she replied, and there was that curve again, the one that made my throat tight. I watched her walk down the street, fade behind the corner. The bell above the door jingled once more. The espresso machine hissed. My thumb stopped tapping. I looked down at my laptop, then at my folded napkin, then back at the empty doorway. And then my phone buzzed. A message. From a number I didn't recognize. "I think you should come by. Today if you can." I stared at it. My heart caught in a quiet, strange way. And just like that, everything felt like it had shifted, though the street outside was still gray and slow, and I still hadn't moved from my chair. I found myself walking down the quiet side street toward her studio, notebook tucked under my arm, hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets. The gray morning had shifted to a drizzle, and the kind of cold that made your fingers ache. I hesitated at the door, then knocked. She opened it before I could step back. "You came," she said, voice soft, like she wasn't surprised but also not entirely expecting it. I nodded. "You said today, so..." My words trailed off, and I immediately wished I'd just stayed silent. The studio smelled like ink and varnish, a little like old wood, and sunlight filtered through dusty windows. Prints leaned against the walls, some pinned, some taped, each capturing a slice of life that felt small and strange and familiar all at once. She gestured toward a kettle. "Tea." We moved in the quiet rhythm of shared space. She poured, her hands steady, and I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers when she set the cups down. I tried not to watch, but the way she lifted her cup to her lips made my chest tighten. "You ever regret a photograph?" she asked suddenly, not looking at me. I blinked. Regret. Yes. Capturing a moment that maybe shouldn't have been. She let out a small laugh, almost embarrassed. I mean, I've done it. Not just the taking, but showing it. I considered my own camera bag at my feet, the half-finished shots I deleted last week. Sometimes I think some things are better kept in your head, I said. And I realized, too late, that it sounded like I was confessing more than photography. She glanced at me then, her eyes soft but steady, and for a heartbeat I thought she might say more. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned over a print, adjusting the angle with quiet care. The weight of the space between us pressed gently. It wasn't just the age difference, or that she was my friend's mom, or that her divorce still hung like a quiet shadow. It was that she existed in a zone I wasn't supposed to inhabit, and yet here I was. Imagined scenarios ran like static in my mind, her hand brushing against mine by accident, lingering too long on a photograph, the quiet thrill of being trusted with small truths. "Do you ever miss before?" she asked, almost as if reading my thoughts. Before everything got complicated? I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread, letting my eyes rest on her hands. "Sometimes," I said, "but I'm not sure what I'd go back to." She laughed softly, shaking her head, and I noticed the faint crease near her eyes, the one that appeared whenever she smiled honestly. "Complicated is all we get," she said. There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't need words. We moved silently among the prints, adjusting them together, our shoulders brushing occasionally. I tried to act casual, but I felt like my chest was too loud, too eager. Finally, she reached for a frame near the edge of the table. Her fingers lingered on mine, just for a second, maybe less, maybe more. I felt a spark in the quietest part of me. The gesture meant nothing and everything at once. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The rain had stopped by the time I left her studio, but my jacket was still damp, clinging to my shoulders. I kept replaying the small spark of her hand brushing mine. Nothing more than a second, but it lingered, pressed against my ribs like it belonged there. I thought about calling, texting, anything, but the phone stayed in my pocket. Part of me hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know what I might hear. The next day, I saw her at the local cafe, tucked into the corner by the window, sketchbook open. I thought about sliding in beside her, but then someone waved, my friend, laughing too loud, and I froze. She looked up, caught my eye, and I saw it. The slight twitch of a smile. The way her fingers hovered over her cup as if unsure whether to lift it. I chose another table. Close enough to watch, far enough to seem casual. I sipped my coffee, noticing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the faint crease of concentration on her forehead. It should have been ordinary. Instead, it made my chest ache in a slow, stubborn way. When the cafe cleared a little, she approached, carrying a plate. "I thought you might like this," she said, laying it down without meeting my eyes. Her hand brushed mine again, a whisper of a touch, and I felt the world tilt for just a fraction. "Thanks," I said, words almost lost. I wanted to say more, but I didn't. We sat in silence, eating. She hummed softly to herself while tearing a piece of bread. I noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she exhaled like she was letting something out she couldn't name. Then the door jingled. A friend from her book club stepped in. She glanced toward me quickly, as if the moment had been interrupted, then straightened, a little rigid. My chest sank. The moment, delicate and fragile, had been paused, maybe permanently. We finished in a quiet tension, words reduced to the occasional nod or soft laugh. Her gaze kept flicking to mine, then away. I felt the familiar tug. I wanted to lean in, to close the space between us, but some invisible line held me back. Age. Responsibility. Everything complicated. Afterwards, she walked me to the door. Rain-slicked sidewalks gleamed under the streetlight. I was breathing too fast. My hands itched to reach out. Her coat brushed against mine as she adjusted the collar. Thanks for coming," she said, voice soft. I nodded, unsure whether I was shaking or steady. "Yeah, my words trailed. She stepped closer, closer than casual. I could feel her warmth, the faint scent of her perfume, the weight of all the unspoken things between us. My hand lifted slightly, almost involuntarily. Then a sound from the street, a car door slamming, and the moment cracked. Her eyes flicked away. I dropped my hand without thinking. "See you," she said, softer than usual, and for a second it almost sounded like an apology. I watched her walk away, every step deliberate, careful. My chest ached in that familiar, quiet way. I wanted to call her back, wanted to bridge the space, but the words wouldn't come. I left the cafe, rain dripping off my jacket, hands in my pockets. And I realized we'd been close. Too close. Almost too close. Almost. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that slants low and golden, catching dust motes in the air. We were sitting on a bench outside the gallery, the street empty except for the occasional car. She had a sketchbook in her lap, but she hadn't touched it in a while. I kept my hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee, pretending to watch the way the light bounced off the windows across the street. But really, I was watching her. The crease of her forehead when she noticed a smudge on her sleeve. The faint tremor in her fingers when she adjusted her bag. "I saw you at the cafe yesterday," she said, voice quiet, almost hesitant. "With him." My stomach tightened. Oh, I didn't know who she meant exactly. A friend? Someone else? I wanted to clarify, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. She didn't need me to answer. Her eyes had gone somewhere far, somewhere that made her shoulders slump just slightly. "I don't know why it bothered me so much," she said. Her thumb traced a line along the edge of the sketchbook. "It shouldn't. It's silly." But she stopped, and the pause stretched long enough to pull the world in close. I shifted, trying to appear casual, though my chest felt tight. You don't have to explain." "I know," she whispered, but her voice carried something fragile, something unspoken. And I realized then, this wasn't just about someone else. It was about me, about what I might mean, about the boundaries we hadn't crossed, but hovered above, like fragile glass. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to tell her everything, even if it was wrong, even if it would ruin things. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers hover over the edge of the bench, small movements that counted for nothing and everything. She laughed softly, almost to herself. "I'm not good at this," she said, like a confession, like a warning. "Not talking about things like feelings." I swallowed. "Neither am I," I admitted. The words felt heavy and reckless. I wanted to say more, wanted to bridge the space between us, but the pause swallowed them. Her gaze met mine, steady now, quiet and raw. There was something exposed in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Something like trust or fear or both. I wanted to ask, could this happen? Should it? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, we sat there, shoulder to shoulder, hands barely touching the wooden slats of the bench. The street hummed softly around us, indifferent. My heart raced, and I realized I didn't care about the world outside that moment. She shifted slightly, closer, then paused. Her hand brushed my sleeve, almost accidental, almost deliberate. I felt it like a spark, and my own hand twitched toward hers, stopping just short. She started, then stopped. I waited, and waited, and the pause became louder than any confession could be. And then she looked down at the bench, as if weighing something too big to say aloud. I wanted to ask the question for both of us, the one hanging between breaths and space. What happens now? The week after the bench, she stopped answering my texts as quickly. Not ignored exactly, just delayed. Hours, sometimes a day. A shrug in the digital ether that made my chest tighten without reason. I waited outside the gallery one afternoon, hoping to catch her as she left. She walked past me without noticing, hair tucked into her coat, eyes focused straight ahead. I stepped forward, called her name softly. She glanced up, startled, and then something closed. A polite smile, quick, measured, and she kept walking. I stopped in place, letting her retreat. My fingers twitched around the strap of my bag, a small, helpless motion. I hadn't expected distance. Not now. Not after the bench, the light, the near confessions. That evening, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Her handwriting, neat but hurried. Inside, a single photograph, a boy no older than 10, holding a crumpled drawing, a faint smile on his face. No note. I stared at it, heart hammering. I knew then. I had forgotten. The context she carried silently. Mother. Responsibilities. A life complicated and separate from the small bubble we'd been inhabiting. I tried calling. Tried texting. Each message lingered unsent. My thumb hovered over the send button for minutes, sometimes half an hour, until I closed the phone, frustrated with the quiet that was no longer comfortable. I imagined her with him, ordinary moments that weren't mine, breakfast, school runs, bedtime stories. And I imagined myself fading into the edges of that life, a shadow I wasn't meant to occupy. The thought wasn't devastating, just a pull, a whiplash of hope followed by a hollowed pause. I saw her briefly at the cafe the next morning. She was laughing at something a friend had said, hair catching sunlight through the window. I wanted to wave, to cross the room, but I stayed at my table, coffee cooling, notebook untouched. Our eyes met briefly, just enough to acknowledge something, and then she looked away. I felt myself withdraw without realizing it, almost instinctively. I didn't feel anger, not even jealousy exactly, just suspended. Suspended in the small gap between what we had almost begun and what the world insisted we weren't allowed to touch. Even at night, I couldn't erase her from the quiet corners of my apartment. The photograph on my desk, folded napkin from our first cafe visit, a page in my sketchbook she'd glanced at, all reminders that I existed in the margins of her life. I tried reaching out once more. My thumb hovered, then moved away. Another message left unsent. Another knock at her door unmade. And I sat in my apartment, staring at the streetlight flickering outside, thinking about the bench, the coffee, the half-confessions. About all the things left dangling. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I found her in the gallery just before closing, alone except for the fading light slipping through tall windows. She was stacking prints on a low shelf, sleeves rolled up, hair loose around her shoulders. The quiet hum of the city outside barely reached us. I hesitated in the doorway, hands shoved into my jacket pockets. My chest was tight, the usual rehearsed words useless. She looked up, startled. "You're here," she said, voice low, measured. I came," I said. That was all I could manage. She didn't move, just tilted her head slightly, letting me read her expression, curiosity, caution, something like hope. I stepped closer, letting my fingers brush against the edge of a print as if to steady myself. I know I haven't been easy. With messages, with everything, I said. My words felt clumsy, inadequate. She nodded, not interrupting. I know, she said softly, then added, I wasn't either. We both laughed quietly at that. Awkwardly, the kind of laugh that opens a door you've been hesitant to knock on. The tension between us didn't vanish. It sat in the air, heavy and persistent, as though the walls themselves were listening. I wanted to say more, to tell her what lingered in every glance, every brush of hands. But the weight of our circumstances, her life, the age, the boundaries, pressed down. She moved toward the counter, offering me a cup of tea. Sit, she said. The invitation was simple, ordinary, but it carried everything we hadn't said. I sat, hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup. She did the same across from me. Silence settled, not empty but alive, filled with unspoken truths. I was worried, she admitted finally, voice barely above the hum of the lights. About what all of this, could mean. About us. I nodded slowly, feeling my own chest tighten again. Me too, I whispered. Every time I think, maybe I should just. I let the words trail, unsure whether they were a confession or a surrender. She shifted slightly, a faint tilt closer, and our hands brushed over the table. The touch was light, accidental, and perfect. I felt the tension ease just a fraction. I don't know if we can, she said, softer now. But I don't want to pretend I don't care. I exhaled slowly, the ache in my chest loosening, just a little. Neither do I. We didn't need more. No grand declarations, no promises that life might not complicate further. The acknowledgement, quiet, honest, imperfect, was enough. She smiled, the kind that lifts corners of the mouth and eyes together. Not triumphant, not relieved, just real. I returned it, a small, hesitant curve of my own lips, and let my hand rest lightly over hers for a moment. Nothing forced, nothing claimed, just there. Okay, she said softly, voice carrying more than the word itself. Okay, I echoed. And for that small, ordinary instant, everything shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. Weeks passed after the gallery moment. The rain returned and left again, the city breathing in rhythms I had learned to follow. I found her in small ways. The corner cafe at 8:47 a.m., the way she arranged sugar packets just so, the faint hum she made while stirring her black coffee. Ordinary things that suddenly mattered more than they should. We had fallen into a rhythm that wasn't perfect. She still had her son, her routines, the quiet shadows of her past. I had my own small hesitations, drafts left unfinished, unsent messages tucked into my phone. But now, there was space between us for the things that mattered, shared moments, half-smiles, the weightless touch of hands over coffee cups. One evening, we returned to the bench outside the gallery. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. I brought a small sketchbook. She carried one of her prints. We sat side by side, shoulders brushing. The silence stretched comfortably, punctuated by the soft clink of our cups. I still can't believe you remembered the order, I said, voice quiet, more to fill space than to question. She smiled, not smug, not teasing, just that gentle curve I had memorized. I did. I remember everything, even your napkin folding. I laughed softly, shaking my head. The memory, the gesture, everything we'd nearly stumbled over felt lighter now. I traced the edge of the bench with my fingertips, imagining all the words we hadn't needed to speak and all the ones that had finally settled between us. The gallery lights turned on behind us, warm, golden, spilling into the street. She leaned back slightly, resting her head against the slats. I noticed the faint crease of concentration when she looked at a passing car, the subtle tilt of her head when she considered a shadow. Small things, ordinary things, and yet somehow enough. I'm glad you stayed, she said, voice soft, almost more to herself than me. I nodded. Me too. No grand declarations. No dramatic promises. Just quiet acknowledgement of what had been earned. Trust, understanding, and a slow, deliberate closeness that hadn't needed to be named to exist. We stood eventually, gathering our things. Her hand brushed mine as we walked toward the street, not holding, not claiming, just there. A gesture that mattered more than words ever could. Back in the cafe a few days later, she poured the tea while I stirred sugar into my black coffee. We laughed at something fleeting, a shared joke that neither of us would ever repeat aloud. And I realized, life wasn't perfect. It was warm, grounded, familiar. The bench outside the gallery, the cup at 8:47 a.m., the tiny tremble in her fingers when she tucked her hair back. Those were ours. A language only we understood. I glanced at her across the table. She caught my eyes and smiled. That quiet, knowing smile. And I thought, maybe this is what it means to arrive somewhere softly, without fanfare, without dramatic proclamations, just being present. And I knew, finally, we had.